Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. We'll be starting in just a few short minutes. So until then, if you can make sure that you can hear us well and also write in the chat where you're from in the world, we'll be starting in just a few short minutes.
Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon.
Yeah.
Depends where you are or where you're located. And welcome to our webinar. So, just to start, today's topic is 9 typical mistakes of temperature mapping and how we can avoid them, right? So, a brief introduction first of who are we, right? My name is Aleš, and I'm the BDR manager and compliance consultant for Eupry. I have been here for over 4 years right now. So back in the days where I've been still quite new in the market, and I have a background in mechanical industries, service industry, and now kind of medtech, let's say, to some extent. So, and here we have Jakob.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alice. My name is Jakob. I'm the head of quality here at Eupry. So my responsibility is within ensuring that our own products are validated, that we have quality systems in place, but also the whole section about which we're going to talk about today, which are our professional services or our consultancy services in terms of helping our clients stay on top of mapping qualifications in the different GXP areas. So I've been working with this field for the last 10, 11 years or something like that. My background is in electronic engineering and space engineering. So there's also a lot of fault tolerance from that background that we can move on. But we're very glad to see this many people. It's definitely going to
Exactly.
be a very interesting one. It's one of those topics that we really burn for, and we really are close to our heart. We get tons of questions each day, so we love having these webinars where we can sort of have people engaging. So please as well during this webinar, if you have any sort of questions or comments, just please write them in the chat.
Exactly.
And we'll grab them along the way. It's always a better discussion going on when we have a lot of good questions.
And because we have also two other team members answering the chat, Frederica and Philip, both are product specialists. So just ask them anything you need to, and we'll try to answer all your questions timely. Otherwise, we'll kind of come back on the under the Q&A session.
Absolutely.
So let's start here. So first of all, who are we? What is Eupry, right? Eupry is a Danish company, at least started in Denmark. Now we have expanded worldwide. We are present in more than 50 countries with offices in the United States. And Eupry is actually a spin-off of the DTU University project, correct?
Absolutely, yeah.
And what we do right now, many years have passed. So what we try to provide our customers is kind of a one-stop solution to guarantee your temperature and environmental compliance. That means we cover everything from mapping to monitoring, validations, and also to make you kind of have a successful audit at the end of the day. We cover many different topics, everything that is kind of related to temperature compliance, but we're not here for a sales pitch, right? So let's move forward to the main topic and what is the agenda for today. So we'll start with what is actually just temperature mapping. That will be needed just that we are all on the same page, that we all know what we're talking about. Then we'll pass down to the structure of a temperature mapping, and then we'll go into the interesting part. The main things that we see during the mapping process that goes wrong, right? So, and here we'll dive into the protocol process, the execution process, and reporting process. And then we'll spare the last 10-15 minutes for a Q&A session where me and Jakob will try to answer the main questions that have popped out in the chat.
Absolutely. And if you have any questions along the way, we can see your questions here on the screen. So please feel free to shoot ahead. And I think today is going to be an interesting topic. Of course, there's always having the negative approach, looking at everything that could go wrong. But most certainly, we see a lot of our customers when we're dealing. We have hundreds of these mappings per year, and we see. We must mention that we have quite a wide range of customers, going all from distribution and pharmacies all the way up to end of manufacturing. So we see a lot of different requirements, but there's also a lot of things that are the same all the way through, even though we see that the industry is quite good actually at understanding the different standards, the different regulations that there are. The guidelines, there are some stuff that just continuously pops up, which is, I mean, we call it go wrong, but it could also mean tips and tricks.
Exactly. And it's totally normal, right?
Yeah.
Practice makes
master, absolutely.
Makes master, right?
Yeah.
So let's start with basically what is mapping and why it matters, right? I guess most of you must be familiar with the V model over here, right? So mapping actually is in a top right part of the V model. Is basically where is the performance qualification and the operation qualification. So the operational qualification, right, if we talk about this, is the phase where we kind of focus on verifying that the system or the equipment is basically designed and for the criteria and not fit for purpose, that comes later, but is actually designed for the operation that needs to basically do. So and this we call it OQ, just because we love acronyms here. So during the OQ, we assess basically all the basic functionalities of the equipment here, and here we want to go. We want to control the environment, or actually the equipment under the normal conditions, under stress conditions, to make it just sure that everything works properly. And that's also just in purely terms of kind of, is this equipment capable of withstanding the environment that we want to kind of control?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think often, as when you and I discuss this is one of the places where we see a lot of people. There's a bit of misunderstanding in terms of where does mapping fit into process validation. And this is a model that we've developed ourselves, of course, based on a lot of other literature out there. But this is really the key to understanding, where does mapping fit in. Mapping is a qualification, it's a test strategy, right? But it fits into validation like all other types of tests do. So it's very nice to just get a sort of a baseline on what are we talking about, what are different vocabularies used in these processes.
And then actually, can you go back one slide? And then is kind of course, the performance qualification, which is the second part. And here we actually focus on confirming that the equipment consistently performs as expected, based on, if we talk about temperature mapping, what's in this case has to be stored in this specific equipment, right? So does this equipment satisfy the requirements of storage of a specific good that is temperature sensitive? And here things can change, right? Because you might have different kind of goods that got stored in the fridge, right? So in this case, based on the goods that you're storing, a different performance qualification perhaps is needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually start seeing a lot of our customers being quite good at designing a performance qualification in mapping, even though there are some quite, I wouldn't say strict, but there's some quite straightforward guidelines on how to perform performance qualification in a mapping. We actually see more and more customers wanting to design specific performance qualifications, which are much more tailored to the exact products that they're storing, exactly as you mentioned. And this is really something we've seen over the last 10 years, that customers are more concerned with the performance qualification being exactly as per the product and the process that they have specifically,
and
which is quite a positive thing,
exactly.
I think. Yeah.
And specific about the process, because a real life environment, that means also people interacting with the equipment, people interacting with the product, etc. So it's kind of testing in real life conditions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So basically, this is kind of why mapping is important. And let's now go a bit briefly into basically how mapping it is kind of structured here, right? So we do have three main mapping processes, which are the protocol, the execution, and the reporting. So the first part, let's say when we talk about the protocols, right? While we're writing protocols, we need to define the objectives, right? What needs to be outlined here? Why we're doing basically this exercise? That's kind of the main question that we have to answer, right? What kind of regulations we must follow, or our customers require us to follow. At the same time, we need to select the right equipment in this process during the writing the protocols. And once we define all of that, the objective, the equipment, the test that we need to perform, then we write down the protocols. Absolutely. I think you are the expert in writing the protocols. So if you have anything to add, feel free here.
No, but I think you're absolutely right on focusing in on the key aspects here, which are basically, what is it we're trying to map, and how should we do it? I think one of the key ideas behind a really good mapping protocol is also that it's a contract between the people writing the protocol, the people who are going to perform it, if those are different people, the people who've ordered it or sort of decided that we need one. It's sort of like a contract that defines exactly why and how are we planning to do this. Exactly. And this is and parts of that is choosing and selecting the equipment. And when signing the protocol, we've often come to a large agreement. That's also what we'll see with some of the pitfalls that we've identified here, that we see coming over again, that we really need to have a really good indication of what the objective is and what the methodology is. So I
Exactly.
absolutely agree. Yeah.
So if we have to sum up, basically the protocol is a detailed plan where we covering every step of the mapping process, from the objective to the equipment to how the exercise will be performed. Step by
Absolutely.
step, that is, it must be written as clearly as possible and easy to execute.
Absolutely.
Then we do have the execution part, right? And also here we have three main components that goes into the execution. One is the site assessment. Of course, we do have then the sensor placement and the data collection, right? So during the site assessments, of course, we need to check what we have to map, right? This can be a smaller fridge, but can be also a big warehouse, any kind of temperature control unit. We need to kind of understand where the HVAC system is positioned, where are the doors, where are the windows, where is kind of the ventilation of the fridge, etc. Sensor placement, that's also very much defined by various regulations. For example, the most common that it's you can encounter are the WHO regulation for sensor placement, so agreed placement of the sensors. But in addition to that, it's very important that we match the regulation with the site assessment, or how the unit is structured, right? Because perhaps you have more critical areas. You might have more doors. Maybe you have plenty of south-facing windows, and all those factors might change the layout that's of the sensors or data loggers. And of course, during the execution, we have the data collection, where kind of over this, because the mapping is basically a test, an exercise in a determined period of time, where we need to ensure that the data are collected effectively, that are recorded also effectively, because that's quite a common mistake, and that we don't kind of that we log data at a regular intervals, so that we have a kind of a consistent and robust base of data that then can we work and perform a reporting afterwards. And that's the last part, the reporting. So is the data analysis. That's why it's important that we have this robust data sets that we actually set up previously. We need to interpret the interpretation of the finding. And here, that's why we have validation engineers working on that. It's not always common knowledge. And we need kind of to have also the right analytical tools here. So everything can be done manually still, but how long it will take if you have 200 sensors placed in hundreds of square meters, right? That will take forever. So after that, we need to prepare the documentation and prepare a thorough reports documenting basically every aspect of the study, including methodology, results, deviations, funds, and the impact on the operating parameters. So, and here deviations are not something negative. It's something that actually prepares us to make our facility or our temperature controlled unit fit for purpose. Once we discover all those small deviations, then we can act upon it. So it's actually a very important step. And after that, of course, we come with the recommendations, which is actually, basically suggesting specific adjustments in the placing of goods or HVAC system, or changing storage practices. For example, you cannot leave the door open for such a long period. Something simple as that. So then you are able to actually come out with a detailed plan how to operate the specific unit.
Absolutely. So Great, thank you very much, Alex. So we're sort of on the baseline in terms of what the mapping process is like, and then we'll move ahead to sort of the key topic today, which is what are some of the mistakes we find out there, or what are some of the tips and tricks in order to make this process more efficient. And we'll take this in chronological order. So starting from the protocol. And I would say that the first thing we see is really not involving the stakeholders. And this can be seen on a very tactical level, but also on a more strategical level. Sorry, those words got caught there. So we mainly see four key interested parties in a mapping like this. We'll have the quality department, could be QA, QC, whoever is in charge of performing the mapping. That could either be physically or during the protocol and the reporting work. We see operations often as the ones that are operating the warehouse, the fridge, the freezer, whatever it might be, or the lab personnel who's dealing with the unit that's going to be mapped. Thirdly, we have the customers who often set the requirements together with the regulatory authorities in terms of what the temperature ranges should be, what the requirements should be, all that. And then lastly, we'll have management as a sort of a proxy for those who will take the long-term decisions. And what we'll often see if we forget to involve all of these stakeholders is that we'll have an off scope or a wrong scope, or a scope that's not going to be long-term enough. Often we see that requirements are based pretty much on what's today and not so much on what the customers would want in the future or what management is planning for. Another key risk we see often in not involving all these stakeholders is that, let's say you're remapping a warehouse, for example, and you might need to control the number of door openings, or you might need to cut off the power in certain areas, what it might be. It's often there's a clash between those who are operating on the floor. Will they know that there will be someone there to come and set up data loggers, or however is this going to be? Sorry. Yeah.
No, I was curious. How do you think, kind of, when you have to do those exercises, especially for bigger companies and all that? Did you ever see that is established a kind of a task force, like a project manager for those kind of activity that is able to tie up all those loose ends and facilitate the communication?
It's actually a really, really good question. And so it's still a huge mystery for me in that even in very big organizations, often the responsibility for mapping is put on to the individual sub-departments or the operational staff and the local quality units for these different things, which means often there's not a huge buildup of knowledge on this topic. And I think that's also why we get a lot of questions regarding this topic. So yeah, as I mentioned before, one of the other things is often that we see missed deadlines because the operational staff are not maybe informed that there will be a mapping and so on such date. So we have a question here from Luca. So I have a question for all participants. In the case of temperature mapping of warehouse, is there any percentage of or number of for the allowed number of data loggers that have stopped working for some reason? And the temperature mapping report is still valid. Thank you, and hello, David. I would totally agree with David. There's really not a specified number. Often what we do see is also one of the points later on here is that if you plan for these sorts of deviation, it's often not that much of a cost to add a few extra data loggers, which means that if you lose some data loggers, well, then you plan for it, so you can sort of rely on the others. Often you would have to look at the distribution of temperature, find some data loggers in the vicinity of the data loggers that failed during a study, and see whether those can justify the lost data during it. Yeah, sorry. So just moving on. For the last part here, not involving stakeholders, often also we see one of the key things we see is operational staff. Apropos missing data, one of the key elements or the key reasons behind missing data we see is operational staff that are very kind. They found a data logger in an odd location and they moved it or took it to an office somewhere just because it was a data logger that's not normally placed in a place like that. And if you haven't informed them well enough, as you mentioned before, well, you're going to have some incidents and you'll have to do your analysis.
Your mapping
again. The second part here in terms of the protocols is planning. And what the implications of this is time delay. We often see this with new buildings, where it's a very high priority from a strategic level to have something done in time, so that you can start having those operational warehouses or fridge freezers, whatever it might be. So the first thing we would mention often as an advice is to have a realistic execution plan. So I've brought a small example here of what an execution plan could be, but often we see people forgetting stuff like stabilization time. So when you turn on a fridge, for example, it can take up to 24 hours before the temperature has stabilized, if enough for you to get data that's reflecting the real world scenario. And for cold rooms or warehouses, it can be up to weeks before you'll actually get very stable temperatures. And they'll often never be turned on from that point in time until there's some service to some of the sub parts of it. But having that part in there, and then another part, which is working hours. I mean, do you have, if it's a new warehouse, have you planned for, there's always some final electrical installations that need to be done just at the very end? And also, have you accounted for when, if you've set up a mapping and you might have counted for 6 hours to set up the data loggers and then start a mapping, it should run for, let's say, 72 hours. Well, when you start to take them down again or start your next test, that might be in the afternoon and people are ready to go home. So having a little bit more realistic expectations
Yeah.
for when people are working and so forth, that's really one of the key elements. And as Luca, thank you very much for that question. That was spot on what we're going to talk about now, which is planning for setbacks. So there's a few different types of setbacks. There's missing data, which is always unfortunate due to technical reasons, but again, often we see that it's humans being involved in the missing data. It might be a displaced logger, it might just have fallen off where it was supposed to be. But often we can plan for these things, and often we can do this by having some sort of real-time data and a vigilance. So when for example, when we plan for very large mappings with warehouses, we will often have someone who's not 24/7 on the case, but would at least look at the data 2 to 4 times during a day, because you can almost always see if there's something wrong. If a certain day, if all the other temperature data points are sort of stable, but one just peaks off or drops down, well, most likely it's because it's been moved, or a door has been opened, or something like that. So planning for those things can often do a lot, and often real time data would be a good precaution method. Yeah.
I have a question for you. You've been talking before about the consideration of the stabilization time, right?
Yeah.
How that plays off with when you do a power shortage test. It will give you kind of insights how actually your equipment also performs in order to be back into a conformity state. There's a correlation between those two things.
Yeah, absolutely. So in power off stages, often what we see is people measure one thing, which is how long time does it take from when I turn off the power until it's non-conformed anymore. But in my mind, going back to your point again, there's actually two things you can measure. You can measure how long time does it take before it goes out of of the acceptable range, and how long time does it take to get back into acceptable range. And that will also, that's some of those things where you actually, that's what you want to measure. So you can also plan for this by designing the plan so that you start the plan by turning it on, and then you'll have some sort of that measure. And there are several different things you can do, but basically being vigilant with the data is often goes a very long way. So sorry, just for the sake of time, but we'll try to get some of the questions here along the way. One of the things often we see which turns into a huge risk is basically not accounting for risks. And just to summarize, we have a model that we use here at Eupry where we would say that we categorize risk in 3 different areas. It could either be compliance risk, technical, or operational risk. And again, if you want a more in-depth explanation of how to use the risk-based approach. We have some other great webinars, and we'll most likely do a lot more on topics. But basically, we sometimes see customers who are very focused on following the guidelines word by word and saying, well, we need some sensors placed in the corners and in the middle and near doors and gates, and that's kind of it. But we often say we need to go through these 3 steps. So the first is compliance risk. Are we in risk of not following any of the guidelines? Most are, because if you have a warehouse, for example, and you follow the guidelines word for word, you'll have thousands of data loggers. And I've yet to see anyone fill a warehouse with thousands of data loggers. The second is technical risk. So that will be something like heating and cooling installations, so HVAC systems, doors, gates, chargers, that sort of thing. And then you'd have operational risk, which are the thing that we often see people use too little time on. So basically, if there is a risk in the way that you load and unload goods from, let's say, a warehouse or a fridge or a freezer or cold, whatever it might be, if you do not account for those when writing the protocol, and you start using the facility or equipment in another way, you're going to have a huge problem. The thing is also, you're only going to see that after you've started use of that facility or that equipment. So using a lot of time, or not a lot, but a sufficient amount of time on looking at all of the risks. And back to the first point, taking in all the interested parties. How does it look today with operations? How is it going to look tomorrow? What do our customers say? Because it can be a burden to conduct these mapping exercises.
Exactly. And this, to some extent, also answers Paula's question. When then they are running mappings for 14 days. Again, that's very much based on your kind of how your country is in this case, right? Does your operations differ in those 14 days? Do you have different people coming in and out? Do you have different processes ongoing? I guess this accounts why you need 14 days in certain instances. Why in certain instances maybe a couple of days is enough. So it's very, very much depends on your case here. Answering this to Paula. Just
if we're talking warehouses, 14 days is not off. Just if this gives you a peace of mind just right now. Okay, but moving on to the execution process.
Yes, and what can go wrong? So let's go here. So what are the key execution challenges while we are performing a temperature mapping? I will ask you if you can press the button. Perfect.
Yes.
So first of all, the first biggest risk is kind of the insufficient knowledge and training, right? Knowledge, this can goes from the QA department, and the training can be also involve other parties in this case. So knowing and understanding the various kind of regulations that we need to follow will allow you to, first of all, write proper protocols, making a efficient exercise, avoid a non-compliance state, and have not reliable data.
Yeah, and I know one thing that if I ask every single one of our validation engineers, they will say is one thing that they need to be trained on. And what is that?
Actually, I don't know.
Good documentation practice.
Okay, so that was it. That was it. So
yeah. Because that you're absolutely. I mean, we talked about this, of course, as well. Like, just the bare minimum of knowing what good documentation practice is. I think a lot of the we have a whole team of engineers sitting here helping our customers with doing these things, and just having valid GXP documents, I think, goes a really long way in terms of training and competencies.
I mean, it does make sense, because if everything is written in a clear, ordinate manner, then I think also for a less experienced, let's say, technician or engineer, it's easier to follow the steps, right?
Absolutely.
So that's actually very, very important, right? Then second point, we have also quite a common aspect, kind of logger misplacement and kind of the non-compliance while placing those loggers, right? This can this also directly connect to the first point, right? Because if you write your protocols like well enough, then theoretically the misplaced in the loggers is almost impossible. But there are so many things that you can overlook. For example, where the HVAC system vents are placed. As I mentioned before, south north facing kind of walls, windows. In all this, if you overlook all those minimal things, then can actually give you false or wrong data. For example, even placing the sensors or the loggers in direct sunlight, it can actually give you a wrong kind of measurements on the position, on the location. Said that, placing also loggers in non-critical positions can give you an overload of data that will be extremely hard then to kind of process, and also that more loggers, more risk that the exercise can go wrong. So here it's very important that you study your grid, you study your site, you study your unit that you have to actually map in order to put the best and most efficient placements for your loggers.
Absolutely.
And then number 3, we went through before actually the communication and collaboration, right? And this is kind of involving all the stakeholders that might get involved directly or indirectly in the mapping process, right? I mean, poor communication can lead to dramatic kind of failures. Imagine just that maybe during this mapping exercise, the operations or the maintenance team planned a full maintenance of the electrical system, and then they cut out the electricity. And so just the communication between departments, it's something to not overlook, but it's also perhaps more complex than we think.
Absolutely, but it's funny because we've seen that before, that there was suddenly a huge overhaul of the electrical systems whilst the mapping is going on. And
Exactly.
either one of those two projects is going to be delayed for sure.
Yes. And last point that I wrote down is kind of, monitoring oversights. And here is kind of missing ongoing data monitoring. So the easiest way to avoid those kind of mistakes and kind of, missing this ongoing data is having a real-time data monitoring system, because, it can be extremely time expensive to not be able to intervene when there is a malfunctioning or a deviation that is kind of out of the ordinary. So having a general oversight, so as you mentioned before, checking in every couple of hours just to make sure that everything runs smoothly can prevent you from like losing weeks of work in this case.
Absolutely.
So yeah, this is kind of the key execution challenges in temperature mapping. But we have another point, which is kind of the pitfalls in data integrity and analysis during the execution. Because, data analysis and data integrity, especially data integrity, is something that is ongoing during the execution, but also being able to access data during the execution will facilitate and kind of speed up the mapping process. In the first point, we have the data collection integrity failures. So what I mean with that, so we need to identify if there is any data gaps, right? If an incomplete or corrupted data have been uploaded, or the equipment can malfunction, and this can seriously undermine the whole study in general. So a very easy way to kind of avoid that is kind of real-time data, having a software that is capable, but also do a test run before doing the exercise.
Absolutely.
Make it sure that everything is running smoothly. Take those half a day and then run the exercise. After that, the misinterpretation and over-analysis is also a very common mistake that we've seen. It is basically, over-reliance on kind of irrelevant data, especially maybe old data that we collected, right? And we don't kind of take care of oversee the kind of the critical environmental changes that can be, if I mapped my facility during summer, this does not mean that it will behave in the same way during winter, right? So there's a misinterpretation of the data here means that the units do not perform the same based on different environmental factors, right? So having access to basically and employ kind of advanced analytics in this case and prioritize relevant data, this will kind of allow to identify what are the critical shifts in temperature and therefore address those critical shifts with our risk assessment. Third point, and this is kind of very tied to what I just said, it's kind of context negligence, right? So ignoring environmental changes, such as maybe it's not just kind of, the seasonal changes, but also small structure modification, then maybe the QA team was neither aware of it. Operational shifts, right? Maybe we do have more people working in a huge warehouse than in the morning rather than in the evening. How this affects the temperature of the goods that are stored. There may be in those bigger warehouses and all that is kind of, the loading or unloading of goods. You have a certain frequency throughout the day. So you need to be aware what is the frequency of those operational activities throughout the days or throughout the weeks, and actually plan your mapping accordingly. And last is the reporting and action delays. So as again, a slow response to kind of data or failures and all that, this will be a significant setback in your mapping. So, having a system that is capable to eventually send alerts where there is a spike outside the ordinary for a certain reason, or sending alerts when the batteries are low. All those kind of example also prevents you to run into situations where the exercise that you've done is not valid anymore.
Absolutely.
So at the end of the day, it's about communication, making sure that the equipment is fit for purpose, like the monitoring equipment, have your calibrations in place. So this is also to prevent data corruption, because if a sensor is not calibrated, how you prove that the measurements are accurate, and conduct, of course, periodic reviews to refine your methodologies, but also conduct periodic reviews of your facilities, of your units. Just make it sure that are in the same state as you assume that they are.
Absolutely. And I think this also ties really well into, we got a question here from Tolcha. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, but does position of data log arranged in storage room affect our data? And I think this is really back to both what I said in terms of the risk-based approach and what you're mentioning as well, that it really had a large impact on where exactly you place the data loggers for what kind of data. And if you misinterpret that context, normally we have a saying that a sensor only really measures itself. A temperature sensor measures the temperature of itself. We just hope and we account for how well that correlates to the temperature of the product that we're actually trying to map the temperature of, if you could say it like that.
Is that a real saying?
It's a real saying, at least, that it measures the temperature of itself. Whether I dug myself down in a hole of trying to explain it any further, that's up to me. But we're trying to measure temperatures where products are stored. I can see that's also your comment there, Finn, as well, in terms of placing data loggers where products are not stored is a common mistake. Again, and I think that's actually on a high level, that's exactly what you said there. You're misinterpreting or over-analyzing on what you're getting, and understanding the boundaries of what you can actually say from the data you have is a really large part of some of the feedback we see our customers getting from auditors as well. But great questions here. So moving on to what are some of the common mistakes we see with the reporting. And one of the first things we see a lot is sort of in the gray area between when you're making your execution of your mapping, conducting your mapping exercises, and the reporting, which is really not following up on the deviations. It really means often you will see some types of deviations out there in reality when we're actually away from our computers, but we forget to follow up on those. That's the one type of deviations that we see people don't follow up on. The other thing is, okay, we see some sort of strange temperature pattern, for example. So let's say we'll have some odd data due after some special type of tests, and we'll say, okay, well, we're still within the specifications, we're still well within the acceptable ranges, but something seems off, but we'll just sort of forget about it. And that often means that our reporting and the auditors will come back and say, what did you conclude anything on the findings that you have? So one key takeaway we would want to have you today is basically assess nonconformities or incidents or incident reports, whatever you'd like to call them, immediately when they occur. So another really good example of this is, let's say you follow along in your data and you see that there's an odd temperature spike or there's an odd change in temperature. Follow up with it immediately, because you will have to justify or rationalize your way out of why that occurred when you're writing the report. So if you can upfront just find out what had happened, so you can assess whether it's required to do something about it, maybe it's even required to start over, it's way less damage or way less value added and time and resources than you just
accepting the deviation.
Exactly. Another thing we often see as well, which can sometimes turn into an issue, is that there might be changes that are made. So let's say the protocol has been made, it's been accepted, reviewed, signed by all relevant parties, and we're ready to start executing. And during the execution, or maybe in the period between approval and the start of execution, there are changes to the protocol. We see this a lot where these are not followed through because, let's be honest, sometimes we're under time pressure. Sometimes we're under really much pressure. Get this rolling, get it started. There might be a lot of money involved in the decision, but we often see that those smaller changes are then not followed through. So we need to make another revision of the protocol. We need to have that reviewed and signed, and then we can start the actions. It is, of course, possible to change, let's say, the acceptable ranges afterwards, and that your whole data analysis takes on the basis of another temperature range. But sometimes these changes will have an impact on your methodology as well. We've seen cases where in larger warehouses where there was a certain setup, a certain layout of pallet shelves, the whole thing went through the protocol writing. There was a methodology where data loggers should be placed. And then when we turned up on site, the people on site had chosen to place their shelves slightly different, cutting out a few shelves and so forth. That does change quite a lot in your methodology on where the risk zones are. We also see it a lot with changing HVAC systems and so forth. So it's a really good idea to plan for these changes. Be aware what is the succession line, who is going to account for these changes.
It's a chain event in this case, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But we see it happen surprisingly large amount of cases that everyone has agreed this is what we'll do, this is what it'll look like, and then in the end, when you get on site, oh, we'd like to do X, Y, Z differently. Sometimes we also see it at that just before someone from management often finds out, or more strategic role at least finds out, oh, we have a customer who would like to have these ranges instead. Can we do that? So it's very very important to keep that in mind. Another huge pitfall we often see is that we'll have a missing review of documentation, and that will be in several different times and in several different layers, as I'll get into detail with. But first of all, it often means that we'll have some invalid reporting. If we have something missing from test plans that have not been filled out, it is often very, very difficult to try and trace back and try to assess whether those data are still valid. And often that results in project deadlines which are missed. As you mentioned before, often some of the things that you'll often see in terms of training and communication is just purely good documentation practice. That would be top of the line if it's my project. If it was my warehouse and my mapping project, I would absolutely put good documentation.
And that goes from the people that are responsible from writing the protocols, but also to people that are actually executing the exercise, because they might be two different teams, right? And
Absolutely.
the test plans are followed by the executioners, right? And they must actually follow the checklist, basically.
Yeah. But what we often see that there's a lot of review that could have been done at that step, and that's exactly. Thank you, Alice, for bringing me forward for this to this next point, which is exactly conducting these reviews at smaller steps. Sometimes what we see when, especially if we have a central task force of people who are in charge of a mapping and some other people who are responsible for conducting the mapping, is that the documentation will only be reviewed once it's scanned in or physically sent by mail, whatever it might be, to the people who need to review it. And there you find out that there's a mistake. There you find out there's some missing documentation for where a certain locker was placed, or whether it was actually confirmed that it was placed in that location. And then what do? Then it's a lot of both time and resources to trace back and assess whether this is still relevant, is it still valid documentation. So reviewing it in smaller steps along the way is a really time saver. Another thing is really also to have more than one reviewer. Especially one thing is to look through and see whether all the formal requirements are there. Do we have signatures all everywhere? Do we have dates in the right formats? Blah blah blah. All those things, which are pretty easy to sort of follow through. But the acid test, the logical test of looking through, okay, do these dates actually make sense? Like, you'll be surprised by how many times we see that an end date is before a start date, or you see someone having started something where they might not have been used to using. They might have used AM PM, and now they're using 24-hour notations, and whatever smaller details where you can just see from the data saying there's something that doesn't add sense up here. That kind of review is so much harder to trace back on, because a missing signature, whatever it might be, often you can trace that back, and you can sort of rationalize your way out of saying, well, it's the same person who filled in all the others, he just forgot X, Y, Z. But those where it's just a wrong date, or it's a wrong number, or it might be a number that's really poorly written, whatever some of those things are, those logical tests can really save a lot of time and resources. Yeah. So that was kind of it for us today. I think we'll just if you have any more questions, please write them in chat. Otherwise, we'll try to follow up on some of these things here. So so we have a question here from Jonathan Friesen saying, are there any guidance on when a summer winter mapping needs to be done, a certain temp difference in the seasons? So that's a really good question, Jonathan. So often what we do is that saying, okay, that is part of the technical risks for your certain area where it's placed. So the first thing to look at saying, if you have a piece of equipment, do the surrounding temperatures change? Yeah. Because often we'll see someone having, or sometimes a few times I've seen customers having a cold room or fridge or whatever it might be inside a temperature controlled warehouse. Well, if the surrounding temperatures are not changing, there's no need to do a summer or winter time. Exactly. But that leads us on to what happens if it's a warehouse, for example. And what we've often seen, special governmental auditors being very happy about, is that you do a general study of what are the generally lowest temperatures and the generally highest temperatures, like winter or summer, or vice versa, and then trying to figure out, during my study, did I get temperatures that resemble those temperatures? It's not necessarily that we have, let's say, the lowest winter temperature in Denmark might be, I don't know, minus 10 degrees or something. I can't remember. As long as you get temperatures that are roughly in that area, what we're getting out of the MAPI study is not that it can survive minus temperatures and still be within the ranges. That's not the main case. the main objective. The main objective is to find out when it's very cold outside and when it's wintry temperatures, for example, where will we get our hot spots and cold spots?
Exactly.
So the key justification here is to say, well, we might have found 1 to 3 hot spots and 1 to 3 cold spots in our warehouse. And if those are still within acceptable ranges when it's winter, well, then we most likely all of the rest are also within those ranges. So it's not necessarily that we have to hit spot on the coldest of coldest winter and the hottest of hottest summer. It's just that we get in somewhere where it's reasonable, similar to summer and winter. I hope that answered the question.
If I may add just something as well, it's kind of basically you perform a study how the facility behaves in those cold and hot months, and also how the eventually in the case of a warehouse, the HVAC system reacts, right? Because during winter, the HVAC system, let's say that we have to monitor an ambient environment, it will create more hot spots than cold spots than during summer, most likely.
Yeah.
Okay, we never know, but I mean, the heating will go on, right? So that's the whole point of doing the mappings in different seasons, because HVAC systems are regulated based on the external environment. So that can actually change those critical or risk areas quite dramatically.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's also where it's so important to have a good understanding what your system design is like, because I've seen examples of facilities where the HVAC system adapts to whether it's winter or summer.
Yeah, of course.
And where you cannot. There's a crossover date somewhere. I've never quite found out what date it's summer, what date is winter, whatever. There's a crossover date where exactly as you mentioned, where the cold spot and hot spot might change dramatically because the whole control methodology changes absolutely. So there's a really good question here from Peter as well. If the client doesn't know what to do, who is responsible for instructing him on what he should map and what he shouldn't? Luckily, that's quite clear. If you're applying for either a GDP certification or GMP certification, you should know. If not, you should inquire with the consultant who can help you identify what to be mapped and what not. And it might also be if you're working with the pharmaceutical cannabis, whatever medical devices, you need to, the regulations are quite clear on the fact that you would need to know exactly what products would require mapping, if that was your question. So you have a follow-up and saying, so I hope that answered the question. And also I'm very excited to share that we have some on the call here as well, David, who can surely help you if you're missing some consulting in terms of what to map and not. And we have some exciting news that we'll definitely share with everyone on a later stage. So another question here from Peter, which will probably be the last one. Considering today's weather conditions, how realistic is it to catch the 7 days required for temperature mapping of a warehouse? Really good question again. And again, you don't need to catch the exact days where it's coldest in the weather or because you could keep on going. You could also say, oh, it might be a little bit colder next year or next year or next year or whatever it might be. So it's not really the point to catch the coldest. It's just to have temperatures that are sort of resembling the coldest and the conditions that you would often get.
Maybe we have time for the last one.
Yeah, let's do the last question here from Fogg. We're currently planning a temperature mapping of a few freezers, and there are a lot of discussions regarding where to place our sensors on the shelf. The theory is, if placed too close to the sides, the airflow can alter the temperature profile, and we will get cooler readings. How far from the side and back plates must the sensor be placed? That's actually back to, I think it was Finn who mentioned it up here earlier, that you need to place sensors where your products are placed. Yeah. So sometimes mapping is not a straightforward test where you'll just conduct the test and you'll get some results. Often it's a bit of iteration, finding out how close to the sides can you actually place products. Because the short answer is you should place sensors where your products are placed.
Yeah. It has to follow a realistic operational pattern,
absolutely.
right? doesn't make sense to perform a mapping that does not follow how you operate these actually units.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think this was pretty much the last we had time for. But thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for some great questions. It's always really nice to have a few questions along the way. I think. Okay, there's.
I think we missed one from Luca.
Sorry, but there was a really nice request for having answered the last question here. Where. Sorry. I think we actually we answered that question regarding missing data from data loggers.
Yeah.
Anyway, if you have any questions, please feel free to email us or contact us on LinkedIn. I will be more than glad to help. But thank you very much for a lovely webinar. And again, we have previous webinars that also dig into the topic of temperature mapping on a more general level. And we have some that are much more focused, like the ones today. But also, please do keep yourself updated on both our LinkedIn and our websites. We have webinars every single month.
Exactly, yeah. You can find a lot of information on our website. We have a knowledge sharing center over there. And, just to stay in theme, stay cool.
Yeah, stay cool. Not too cool, though.
Yeah, not too cool.
Have a good time.